going to be our first and primary speaker today. She's the Senior Manager for Strategy and Policy at the National Women's Law Center, and she's a native of San Francisco Bay Area and a graduate of the University of California, Berkeley, where she received her dual Bachelor of Arts with honors in Rhetoric and Asian American Studies. Jenalyn is in a key position at the National Women's Law Center to tell us about some of their major collaborative initiatives with other organizations. And she leads the Women's Pathway to Justice initiative, which seeks to build an inclusive society by centering women and girls in 2020 and beyond. She has professional and academic expertise in federal, state, and local government and civil rights and minority issues, coalition building, cross-cultural communications, and progressive public policy. Her legislative experience includes diversity and inclusion, voting and civil rights, immigration, and mental health. She is passionate about leveraging stories across all platforms and narrativizing data to advance the best outcomes for all, especially marginalized and underrepresented communities. Jenalyn, do you want to add anything to that about you before you get started in your topic?
Well, thank you for that very lovely introduction, Sue. I had actually incorporated just a little bit about the pathway in my presentation, so I can go ahead and kick things off.
Go ahead.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Jenalyn Sotto. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And as Sue said, I am the Senior Manager for Strategy and Policy at the National Women's Law Center. We're a national organization based in Washington, DC, but work with state partners all across the country to fight for gender justice in the courts, in public policy, and in our society. In my role, as Sue mentioned, I lead the center's Pathway to Gender Justice initiative, which is a multi-phase policy, organizing, and community engagement effort that seeks to build an inclusive society by centering women and girls and gender-expansive folks in 2020 and beyond. The Pathway Initiative goes deep with long-time partners in key early and battleground states like Virginia to drive a targeted and national conversation around an intersectional gender justice agenda. So that was the little bit that I included in my remarks, just to give context for why I'm here to talk with you all about the We Demand More letter and campaign, and how it is a big part of our work responding to the COVID crisis and emerging work to pivot COVID relief and recovery toward transition planning. So the impetus of We Demand More, the letter, the campaign, we at the Law Center did some research into the share of frontline workers who are women, whether it's hospital workers, grocery store workers, childcare workers, people who are staffing shelters and other places where survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault are going. The face of frontline workers of this crisis is that of a woman, and very, very often a woman of color. And when you look at the sectors that have been decimated and truly impacted by the economic fallout of COVID-19, it's also women-dominated sectors, like low-paying service jobs in restaurant, retail, and childcare. So it's really women of color who are experiencing some of the harshest impacts of this crisis, given that the crisis is exacerbating even greater wealth, employment, and health inequities that women of color face due to systemic racism, sexism, and xenophobia. So all that to say, even if the virus itself doesn't discriminate, as so many continue to falsely argue, the impacts reflect and amplify centuries of discrimination. So this We Demand More letter came together in late March and early April from all of us looking at each other and saying, we are clearly crucial to responding to this crisis and are being disproportionately impacted. And yet, we aren't being centered in the policy response. So there have been several COVID relief and recovery bills that have come out of Congress. Several of them have passed and have provided some important and immediate relief, but they are insufficient and they continue to be insufficient at best and actively bad on many fronts for the people we fight for and with. As I think you all know, for example, the paid sick and family leave provisions of the first Coronavirus Response Act, as well as the CARES Act, left out millions of workers through various exemptions. For example, Boeing got more bailout money than the entire childcare sector, which we know is primarily staffed and run by women of color providers. Additionally, women who are undocumented and overrepresented in the jobs being impacted by the crisis are being carved out of key relief provisions that Congress has passed so far. And the list goes on and on and on. In short, women are being left behind, left out, and in some cases, actively attacked. For example, Michigan, one of the most impacted states by the virus due to long-standing policies enacted by Michigan state legislators and previous administrations, as well as comorbidities experienced by impacted and vulnerable populations, took on, because of Governor Whitmer's leadership, really aggressive and, as of the latest studies, effective COVID mitigation tactics. And what did she get? She received some really targeted, really violent, really vitriolic conservative backlash for her leadership. Just gonna say it, white men draped with guns and Confederate paraphernalia stormed the Michigan State Legislature without social distancing, without masks, and also showed up at her residence making threats with semi-automatic rifles. How is that not a targeted and sexist response to leadership and mitigation measures that took the factor of spread from 3 to 0.08? Some of the lowest spread numbers that we've seen here in the United States. So we thought it's time that this time really called on us to come together, and by us, I'm talking about the women's community, the gender justice community, national and state partners, as an entire movement to flex and make a show of strength to say we will not be left behind or forgotten. So dozens of partners from the Law Center to YWCA and Planned Parenthood to Ultraviolet and A Better Balance came together to integrate priority policies from across the movement, to organize them into a demand letter so that we can be united in a set of demands that we're making on the policy front. So every time a new bill, a new package is being discussed, and our friends, our congressional friends, reach out to any of us saying, what should we do? We have a unified list of 4 demands that I'll go into in a little bit, that we are rallying behind to ensure that women, girls, our families, and gender expansive folks are not left behind, that they are centered, and that no additional harm is being perpetrated against us and our communities. Just a little bit of background, we did this letter, and we were also cognizant of who was at the table in writing this letter. Predominantly national organizations that were historically led and founded by cis het white women. And so to truly lean into and live our values, in mid-April, shortly after the first iteration of the letter was written and shared with the community, we held an open call with other national and state partners to open the letter to feedback and to rebrand the effort as the wider We Demand More letter and campaign, which you can find at wedemandmore.org. O-R-G. So that's wedemandmore.org. So what the letter demands, and I'll try as best as I can quickly run through the letter's demands, because if you actually read through it, it's multiple pages. And since many of us are very wonky, as well as trained lawyers, we went pretty deep and granular into some of these proposals. First, it demands that Congress put women and their families ahead of corporations. Let me say that again. We demand that Congress puts women and their families ahead of corporations like Boeing or Amazon, including ensuring women have workplace, health, and other critical protections they need. So key asks within this category include ensuring basic labor rights by, for example, providing PPE and OSHA standards for frontline workers, paid sick time and family and medical leave for all workers, both now and after the current crisis. It also includes enacting employee protections to ensure no parent or caregiver experiences job loss because they don't have childcare now or during re-entry after the crisis. And that's really important. And it includes extending filing deadlines for complaining of employment and labor violations and ensuring robust enforcement of civil rights protections instead of trying to roll them back during this period, as we have seen a number of federal agencies doing. For example, EEOC rolling back its pay data collection mandate. This first category also includes ensuring access to comprehensive and affordable healthcare to ensure everyone's medical needs are met. So that means special enrollment periods and guaranteeing COVID-19 testing and treatment with no cost sharing, including for ineligible immigrants. It means strengthening Medicaid funding and coverage. And it also means recognizing that reproductive health care, including contraception and abortion, are essential forms of health care and protecting and expanding access to it. And we've seen several federal lawmakers as well as state lawmakers capitalizing on this emergency period to push forward making accessing contraception harder or flat out banning abortion, like what Tennessee just did a few days ago. The second category of demands is to get relief to women and their families now. That means helping families meet basic needs by increasing SNAP benefits during the crisis, expanding resources for rehousing, addressing shelter needs, providing assistance to prevent homelessness, and especially doing this for survivors of domestic and sexual violence. It also means strengthening unemployment protections so that benefits reach more people, are more adequate, and are responsive to economic indicators, not arbitrary deadlines. And lastly, it means eliminating asset limits for SNAP, LIHEAP, and SSI. The Law Center recently co-commissioned a poll with some of our partners in Michigan, Mothering Justice, and we found that though the majority of folks received some form of a stimulus check, the vast majority of people in need had to jump through numerous hoops and perform all kinds of acrobatics in order to get insufficient funding in terms of unemployment insurance, in terms of accessing the paid sick and leave accommodations from the CARES Act and CRA, an acronym I always bungle a little bit. And yet that number of people who were able to access it after performing all of the hoops and all of the acrobatics, still utterly small. We haven't released these results yet because we just got them back. They were fielded in late May, early June. But I can tell you only 20% of people were able to access any other form of relief other than the stimulus check, that even that had a lot of stipulations tied to it. Please keep a close hold on that figure because again, we haven't released it yet. The third category of demands is to stabilize state and local governments and the services and jobs that they support. So that means furthering the federal medical assistance percentage, or FMAP. It means ensuring that NGOs that partner with state and local governments have the financial resources and emergency equipment they need to keep operating domestic violence programs, rape crisis centers, legal services, emergency food programs, shelter programs, and the whole umbrella of critical assistance programs that state and local governments run. And it means, very crucially, stabilizing the childcare sector and ensuring that providers have the tools and supports they need to provide care during this pandemic, including providing at least $50 billion to the Child and Development Block Grant. This is really key because in many states and localities, childcare is considered an emergency service to remain open, and yet they have not received very many supports. The bulk of disbursement has fallen on state and local governments to figure out how to include the childcare sector as an emergency service, qualifying for current pots of money. But because it's not very specifically outlined in current legislation, a lot of state and local governments just forget about it, overlook it, misappropriate, and just completely miss out on the childcare sector. It's also interesting that there are some localities that have granted special dispensation for frontline essential workers to receive childcare benefits, and yet fail to include childcare providers as folks who qualify for that childcare support and assistance. One locality actually legislated that the carrying of a firearm is what determines whether or not you are a frontline essential worker. And this was before May 25th and the national upheaval around police brutality, white supremacy, and anti-Blackness. So I'm just gonna let us all sit with that for a second. The final category of asks is to simply do no harm. All relief efforts must include provisions that center and uplift those most harmed by COVID. And that means mandating data collection on racial disparities and making sure the response to COVID-19 actually addresses those disparities. Also, fun fact, none of the data collection accounts for gender and sex. We have no data collection here in the United States around the disproportionate impact of COVID along gender and sex lines. And the letter also names the need to specifically address the needs of historically marginalized groups, including the LGBTQIA community, older women, adolescent girls, Indigenous women, women living with disabilities, and immigrants. And as to immigrants, to stop harmful, and regarding immigrants, to stop harmful rules or rulemaking and enforcement at hospitals, clinics, food distribution sites, and emergency shelters. And finally, the letter very clearly states that all efforts to shut down abortion access should be rejected. So that was a lot. And so while this letter is very much geared towards our congressional partners and the administration, I think the question here is how can state groups get involved? How can state advocates get involved? So over 200 national and state gender justice focused organizations have signed onto the letter, and it has been sent quite a few times to our friends in Congress. It's actually a cardinal document to organize around, utilized by the Democratic Women's Caucus. Groups can still sign on a rolling basis, and now Virginia is actually one of the first state groups to sign on to the letter, and also to amplify on social. So there was a campaign around We Demand More, but the landscape has shifted so much. And by the landscape, I'm talking about we are in a national ongoing reckoning around police brutality, white supremacy, and anti-Blackness, and what it means for our work, in particular, with the context of a pandemic, to really center the needs of Black, Indigenous, and Brown women, girls, and families. And so the campaign, and I use it in quotes, has shifted in its asks and shifted in the way in which it's held itself out in the community, primarily because as we get further into 2020 and into these conversations around anti-racism, which very much includes the gender justice movement, a lot of the thinking now is around pivoting, because a lot of the work we want done in response to COVID and relief recovery have a lot of long-term policy changes and solutions behind them. Of course, we want immediate relief. That's one of the first demands. But as I'm sure as this letter has made clear, a lot of this ties to systemic issues. So now, while we have taken a step back in field and pressing We Demand More in the field, and more so showing up as allies, as really intentional, really strategic allies in the fight against anti-racism and the undercurrents of systemic inequities, we are working together to figure out how to pivot We Demand More into platforms for transition planning. And so for us, that means calling ourselves in and saying, all right, we need to have a larger community conversation around what high-level values we want to send over to the transition teams. So later this afternoon, as I'm sure at least Sue and Connie have seen, possibly others on this call, there was a very widespread invitation sent out to all of the listservs about a women's community call on transition planning that's happening later this afternoon at 4 p.m. There's a little bit of a high-level agenda, but the real purpose here is to get folks talking with one another about what they want to see and what they really want to be able to, what we want to be able to deliver to transition teams, what we need the next administration to do with respect to COVID relief and recovery, because let's be very honest here. We are not through the pandemic. The pandemic is still very much here. Just because states are reopening does not mean we've got tests widely available, that we've got a vaccine on the way, that it is safe for everyone to go back to business as usual, to meet in person. And so we know that our transition plans need to be reflective of that. And the next administration needs to really dig in deep on what that means and how it disproportionately impacts women, girls, and our families. So I think I may have spoken a little bit over time. Oh, okay. I see Connie shaking her head saying, oh, no, you're on time. But that's where we are. I can answer a few questions about what partners are really going deep on certain aspects of the letter, are working on some offshoot pieces of legislation. But I'm going to stop there because I know I have a limited attention span during these fuzzy COVID times, and I think I just spent 15 minutes talking at you.
Great presentation. And I see a lot of great comments, support. I think we're going to hold the questions for the end. So thank you very much. And I'm going to unmute Sue so she can introduce the next person.
I'd like to introduce Karen Mulhauser from Consulting Women. Karen also has a very illustrious past of leading many organizations, too many to name. If you want to name any of them, feel free, Karen, and tell us what you want to tell us about the new organization, Every Women Vote.
Thank you so much, Sue and Connie and everyone else. It's good to see so many names that I recognize. I will just say a little bit about who I am, because if you live this long, there's a lot to say. But I first learned how important it is to engage people in voting back in the 70s when I was running NARAL, the National Abortion Rights Action League, and realized that it's not enough to educate people about abortion rights. It's not enough to lobby Congress about abortion rights. Unless we're involved in elections and electing the people who agree with us on policy issues, they're not going to vote with us. And so ever since then, my life has included significant voter outreach activities. And it was in December that I was, anticipating entering the centennial of women's suffrage and wondering what could I do to help turn out women voters. And also as the 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, how could we make sure that we're engaging women of color in our outreach? And so as I started talking with friends, several of them, including Kathy Sharon, who's with us today from the local League of Women Voters. There's a wonderful team, some helping with fundraising, some helping with creating a website, some helping with outreach to partners. And Celinda Lake, who many of you know, is going to be helping us with virtual focus groups to find the language that will turn out voters, like young voters who traditionally don't vote in large percentages. What kind of language could we use that would, in our messaging, that would inspire them to vote? So that's the summary of it. I can send Sue materials. I think I have, and maybe she has already circulated it, but would love to talk with anyone who has ideas of partners. We just got our 19th partner organization yesterday, which is the Coalition of Labor Union Women. And the partners will each be receiving a small grant in order to put some time into this voter outreach work. Some of the partners, like the National League of Women Voters, don't need our suggestions on how to do voter outreach, but others have never done this kind of outreach before. And so each of the partners will have a room. It's not a page, but it's a room on our website where anyone in the general public can come and visit and learn what they're doing and learn from other groups about how to do voter outreach. And so in addition to grants and being featured on our website, they will also have at no cost to them, have their contact lists enhanced. So get rid of duplicates, add cell phone numbers, add the missing zip codes, and in other ways enhance the lists. And when the lists are returned, they will have the information about which of their contacts and members have never even registered to vote, so they can do special messaging to them and different messaging to the people who vote every year or every election. And so there's a lot of benefits to this. And if any of you know of organizations that might be interested in joining, I think my email is in the listserv that we've all received, and I'd be happy to have a conversation with you online or on the phone. And let's see, what else? Kathy, what did I miss?
I think you got it. I think you...
Okay, because I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but if there is time at the end for questions, I'd be happy to take some questions. And Jenalyn, I just think that your presentation was so fabulous. It was wonderful, and they're lucky to have you over there at the Law Center. So Sue, thank you for giving me this moment at your meeting, and if there's time at the end, I'd be happy to take questions or suggestions.
Thank you. And now we get to hear a perfect follow-on from Ann Anderson, who is the team leader for the DC Statehood activities at the League of Women Voters, DC. Thank you, Ann.
Well, thank you. You know, I was listening to Jenalyn and feeling like, oh man, how badly I wish I could just weigh in on all of those things and talk to my congressional representative and my senators, only I ain't got none. So that's where we are at this point. And that's why I've been working, actually just personally, I've been working on DC statehood issues since 1971. So for the record, on Friday, we're actually going to have a vote in the House of Representatives that will pass because we have more than enough co-sponsors on our legislation, HR 51. So I'm here to basically say a little bit about how we've been doing this and what we've been doing, and really asking for your attention to this issue. You know, Karen and I were saying, oh, long time no see. Well, you know, I'm like, oh my goodness, here I am finally back in this set of community people. And so we're so stovepiped with all these various things. But we all know also how much energy and time and effort it takes to do the kind of networking that's required. So I'm delighted to be here for all those reasons. So just to be clear, the League of Women Voters National is 100 years old this year. So is the DC League, 100 years old. Back in 1921, when we were actually identified and acknowledged as a local league, we called ourselves the Voteless League of Women Voters. And that's, you know, still unfortunately true today, except for being able to vote for president. And I have to tell you, in 1964 was the first time we got to vote for president since 1801. It was my first time voting anywhere. I had just moved to DC, and I was reminded of how people felt when I watched the South Africans come out post-apartheid with their purple fingers. And, you know, it was like the people came out of the polling places saying, I voted. I actually voted. My vote's going to count. So one of the things that I think is really important for us to understand about DC from my perspective is that actually DC is a really young democracy in the heart of the oldest democracy. And so the League has been working really hard on civic engagement on helping people understand what it is that we're actually doing. We joined the People Powered Fair Maps campaign, which is the National League national campaign on redistricting, for the purpose of getting on the map as a state. And that's what we've been doing for the last, well, the People Powered Fair Maps campaign started last fall. But we had been working already for the last 4 years, going on 5, traveling around the country, talking to leagues, because people don't understand the issues and they don't understand what it's like. And I'm sure, I mean, some of you said you were not here in DC, but I know a bunch of you are. And so you know how frustrating it is to have things just, you know, get something in your email, come on, you know, this is a really important issue to you, and we can't do anything about it. So just in terms of what we've done, well, we've been working in a number of different ways. All the normal league things. We've done tabling, we've done webinars, we've done PowerPoints. You can go to our league website, lwvdc.org, and see that we have a DC Statehood toolkit, and we have a whole team of speakers that if you'd like to have us come and talk to your group, your community, we'll be happy to send them out. We've done the training and we're ready to roll on that. We can also do it by webinar. We have transitioned so we can actually do things online as well. So the other thing that I want to say to you at this point is that tonight we have the beginning of our national biennial centennial convention. The National League convention is starting this evening, and they're opening it with a panel on expanding the vote. And included in that will be a segment on DC Statehood. And I'll put the link for that in the chat when I have a chance.
I just did it.
Thank you, Kathy. Appreciate it. There you go. Nice to have the teamwork.
That's us.
Yeah. So part of what I want to talk about is how many times I've gone out and visited, and we've now visited some 30 states, and invariably people basically say, why would we be concerned about DC? Because that seems like a local issue. Well, I'm here to tell you that in terms of things like, for instance, abortion rights, you know, we still are not allowed to use our local funds to fund people who have problems paying for their abortions. So those are the kinds of things. And my sense, since I've lived here since 1964, is that DC is often used as a petri dish for all kinds of social issues. Well, let's try it on DC and see how much it'll fly, and see if we can get people interested and organized to really focus on that. And even if we can't get it all the way across the country, I get to go home to my local group and say, well, you know, I'm your congressman and I took care of things in DC. So there are a lot of ways that we're used as a petri dish and as a bargaining chip, and we're really tired of it. So that is, I see you nodding, Karen. I think that might be the place to stop for now. I'll be happy to talk some more, but I mean, I could talk for a number of hours. But I also want to let you know that DC Vote is having a HR 51 watch party on Facebook tomorrow morning, starting at 9 o'clock, because the vote on HR 51 will be taking place tomorrow. So thank you very much, and I'm really pleased to be here.
Thank you very much, Anne and Kathy, and for all the great leadership that the League of Women Voters DC is doing on this and many other important issues. It would be nice. Maybe we'll actually have a chance, if the elections work out well in November, to get it through both the House and the Senate and get it approved by the next president. So let's be optimistic, but we have to work hard for those optimistic results. And now we're going to hear from our Vice President for Legal Affairs, Jeanette Lim Esbrook. Jeanette, are you ready to inform us about congressional activities related to objections to the Department of Education regulations on Title IX and sexual harassment?
Certainly. I think I unmuted. Can everybody hear me? Well, we have been watching the evolution of a Betsy DeVos effort to issue new regulations on sexual harassment policies. And of course, it includes sexual violence as well as harassment. The final regulation was published in the Federal Register in May of this year. And the National Women's Political Caucus, with the work of Jackie Spear, a representative from the San Francisco area of California, held a roundtable to discuss the impact of these regulations on individuals, advocates, but specifically on former complainants and survivors of Title IX. Let me just do a quick overview of some of the highlights, or maybe lowlights, of the regulations, and then I can share with you many of the comments of the presenters at this roundtable, and finally some of the efforts that can be done while these regulations are proceeding. I do want to say that to pull together comments that everybody made, it's important for us to participate in the electoral process and to work with the National Women's Law Center on their demands. These are all related. And so let me go quickly to the overview. The regulations which were recently published provide a mere 3 months to be implemented by educational institutions. And this is during a period when our educational institutions are struggling with trying to figure out how they're going to start their programs in light of the pandemic. So they also have to make these enormous changes to regulations that inform their grievance procedures, their complaints, their jurisdictions, and they only have until August 14th to do this. The regulations require significant changes to the approach to address sexual harassment complaints, and the emphasis is, quite frankly, on the rights of those accused. There is essentially a rollback on the policies of protecting individuals who've been harassed over the last 30 years. And those efforts are basically been put aside with these new approaches. And I might add that the developing policy occurred under both Republican and Democratic administration. The grievance procedures are now more burdensome. They require direct cross-examination, or they allow for, not required, direct cross-examinations and confrontation between the parties. The emphasis on due process for the accused and these new regulations will have definitely a chilling effect on those who've been harassed to come forward and complain. There's also a limitation on the jurisdiction. Sexual harassment that does not occur within the recipient's program or activities. These are federally funded language that refer to the program or activities. Those that occur outside of program or activities need not be investigated. This would exclude acts in private locations, such as bars, restaurants, private apartments. It also excludes many study abroad activities and complaints that would be filed related to programs that involve study abroad. Single acts of harassment may not be covered if they are not sufficiently severe to deny access to program activities. This requires that a harassed person would either have to leave the education program, drop out of her studies in order for the complaint to meet this very high standard. The Education Department estimates that there will be approximately a 30% decrease in complaints that are filed. They actually, this is a positive statement because it would save money. The Office for Civil Rights would not have to investigate certain complaints up to 30% that they have in the past. Institutions will not have to spend money to follow up on complaints. Basically, what they're saying is an economic benefit is more important than the rights of individuals under Title IX. In point of fact, the cost of litigation that higher institutions will have to meet will probably exceed what the Department of Education has bragged about in terms of saving money. Now, let me go through some of the participants in this roundtable discussion that the Democratic National Women's Caucus held with Representative Spear. I found one of the most impactful statements came from Susan Taylor, who is the system-wide, the UC, University of California, system-wide Title IX director. She said that the university has decided, the university system, so that means all the Cal systems, will have two grievance procedures. One that will follow the Betsy DeVos requirement changes, and another that will essentially be based on the system's code of conduct. It's not necessarily Title IX because of the new regs, but the procedures will cover those disciplinary situations that formerly were covered by Title IX. Unfortunately, Susan Taylor shared with us that unfortunately this is going to cause confusion, duplication of efforts. They're not quite sure how it's going to work, but this is their work around the limitations that the new regs have placed on them in terms of following up on complaints. Also, because of a union staff agreement, there will be a different set of grievance procedures, because if a staff or a professor is involved with the complaint. So I don't know how many institutions of higher education will adopt this approach, you know, a two-part approach to addressing these limitations on the follow-up for sexual harassment grievances, but we shall monitor that. One thing I do want to mention is that you have probably all heard of the 18 attorneys general who have filed for a stay on the implementation of these regulations. In that complaint, I reviewed it, and the one point that relates to what UC system is doing is that the attorneys general indicated they were alarmed that, let me see, that the final regulation provided that any state law addressing sexual harassment that is in conflict with the newly published regulations, the new regulations will prevail. Now, what that particular aspect of the reg will do for the UC system's approach to this remains to be seen. The complaints filed by the attorneys general also pointed out that they were shocked because the NPRM, which we've been working on for 2 years, stated that there would be no preemptory effect of the regulations on any state law. So this remains to be litigated. I do want to give a shout out to the National Women's Law Center. They have been tremendous in leading the effort over this long period of time to address all the review processes, including the Office of Management and Budget, as well as the Department of Education, providing information, support, and encouragement for people to comment and to make suggestions on how changes could be made before the final regulation was published. The limitations by the regulations and what the survivors shared with us, I found very instructive as to how deleterious these regulations will be. A young woman, Amanda Thomas Hole, who is a gymnast, was the 2014 complainant against Larry Nassar, the Michigan State University gynecologist who abused, sexually violated many women gymnasts. Amanda was the complainant who started the Office for Civil Rights and the Department of Education's investigation that resulted in a $50 million penalty against Michigan State University because of violation of the Clery Act and Title IX. According to Amanda, if the new regulations were in effect at the time, her complaint would not meet the standards for being followed up by Michigan State University or by OCR. I found this was astounding. Amanda said that the violation to her occurred in Larry Nassar's private medical office. So because it did not occur on Michigan State's campus, it did not meet that requirement. It was one act. Amanda did not leave college. She did not drop out. Therefore, it was not sufficiently severe or pervasive to meet the requirement. I found that shocking that this incredible, important complaint would not meet the standards of the new regulation. I also want to share personally that I was one of the first OCR attorneys who worked on complaints of sexual harassment in the early 80s. In fact, in 1981, Headquarters OCR received a request for guidance on what to do when at Weber State University in Utah, a financial aid officer had his female clients sit on his lap while he fondled them in order to see if they met requirements for a financial aid that he was willing, that he would complete for them. The fact that it was a one event, and in this case, nobody dropped out because everybody wanted their financial aid, it would not meet the requirements of the new regulations. In 81, this was the very first request for policy guidance that OCR received. The term sexual harassment had not even been developed. It was through conversations with the Department of Labor and the EEOC that these three agencies decided that it should be referred to as sexual harassment. There were also other interesting comments from survivors, and I think that we will have a link to the actual discussions that occurred. Is that correct, Sherry? Or Susan?
Yes, it's correct. We're going to put the link. I was just looking for the link to put it in our chat box.
That's great, because we're running out of time, and there was just one final thing I wanted, or two things I wanted to do. One is that in the K through 12 context, Tashmika Torek, who advocates for K through 12 sexual harassment issues, said that students have less protections. She pointed out that K through 12 students have less protections than employees under the employees who have protections under Title VII, or for racial harassment under Title VI. So her efforts were to ramp up the training that is needed for students in the K through 12 arena. Her training, I thought, was particularly insightful in terms of practical suggestions. Her training includes making sure that students know their Title IX rights, including the definition of sexual harassment and sexual violence, to also know community resources that they have and how to connect with them, connecting with advocates that can help them. She also has a program that has students practice on how to file a complaint. Do they know who their Title IX coordinator is, or do they know who they should go to? Because this is a requirement under the new regs. Only certain individuals are able to accept a legitimate Title IX complaint. Tashmika also suggested that students have a copy of Title IX policies of their school, and to be able to show it to the administrator that they're complaining to, or the teacher they're complaining to, or the coordinator they're complaining to, and to show how their rights have been violated. There were a lot of statements from survivors that said, well, the policies were there, gold standard, written very well, and stated their rights completely, but enforcement of those policies were decidedly missing. The second thing I want to go over very quickly, and then I can turn it back for Q's and A's. Shawali Patel, who is in the National Women's Law Center, are great leaders in this area, had wonderful suggestions on what we might look to for ways to address the DOS regulations. First, she said that Congress could conduct oversight hearings on how these regulations were developed and how the department can develop an actual bill in Congress to overcome the regulations that follow the 18 attorneys general's complaint and support them. Also, the Higher Education Act is up for reauthorization this term, and through that, there could be legislation that could overcome the effects of the regulations. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to back to Connie and Sue for Q's and A's. Thank you, everybody.
And thank you, Jeanette. Let's have Q's and A's on any of the presentations that you've heard. Connie?
I wanted to ask Anne. So it's going to pass in the committee meeting, am I correct, this week? And then what happens? So what's the real thing? Because we know Trump is not going to agree. So it's, you know, whatever happens, it's going to have to come back and be revoted on to drop the veto. What's the possibility of that is what I'm asking, I guess.
Okay, well, let me first of all be really clear. It has passed the committee. On Friday, it will actually be going to the House floor, and the entire House will vote on it. And that's the historic moment. I mean, I can't tell you how many times over the years people have said, well, has this ever gone to the House? And, well, it did go to the House in 1993. It went actually on the House floor, but it failed. So this time it will be going to the House floor, and it will pass because we have enough co-sponsors. Now, of course, then it will be sent to the Senate where it will die because, well, it will die. But we now have 226 co-sponsors of the current statehood bill in the House, and we have 40, and last I saw, 40, maybe it's up to 42 now, but it's at least 40 senators who have signed on as co-sponsors of the companion bill. So we all know that on day one of the next session, we will be resubmitting it, and we will ask everybody to co-sponsor who's co-sponsored before and who's still there. And we will ask for everybody who votes for it, who hasn't co-sponsored, to also co-sponsor. And we will proceed with, you know, continuing. This is why I'm saying, you know, if you all can see the connection between the multiple issues that we have, that we've been talking about here, and the way that the 705,000 plus people who live in Washington, D.C. have nothing to say about any of this. And yet we are obligated to follow all those laws, and pay all that money. We pay more money, more taxes than 22 states, so on. So just to make it clear about what the bill looks like, in case people haven't had a chance to look at it, what it really does is it just redraws the boundaries of the federal district. It makes it from the whole District of Columbia, it shrinks it down to a 2-mile square or so, just about 2 miles, that's around the core of the city, the monumental core, the governmental core. And Congress has already redrawn the boundaries of the district a number of times. The biggest one was when they gave all the Virginia side back to Virginia before the Civil War. So, you know, the precedent is there. They can do this. They have full control over anything to do with the District of Columbia. So they can make it smaller. They can't make it bigger. The Constitution says can't be more than 10 miles square, but this could be 2 miles square. And after that, then the residential and commercial parts want to be a new state. And that's how the bill works. There are also a lot of transition, there's a lot of transition language in it about how it would then move from being the District of Columbia to a new state. And so all of that will continue to proceed, and we'll just start over again with the next session. But here in DC, we have no power except to ask you all to do something for us. And that is what we keep doing. And I tell you, people out there don't know. I can't tell you how many times people have said to me when I've gone out and said, oh, hi, I'm from the DC League of Women Voters talking to your league. And they're like, oh, you live in DC? I'm like, yeah, along with 705,000 of us. We live in DC. And so it's really hard to even get our heads around the fact that it's a colony, like Karen was talking about. So hope that helps.
I'd just like to comment that one of the purposes of the clearinghouse is to help women's organizations and other organizations interested in women's issues to work together on some issues that they may not normally work on. And so we are also members of the Clearinghouse on Women's Issues as a member of the We Demand More Coalition, and Jeanette is going to be our representative from the Clearinghouse to the transition task force activities that the National Women's Law Center and others are heading up. More questions? Does anybody have any more questions on any of the speakers? Comments? Suggestions, ideas?
Unmute yourself if you'd like to ask it.
This is Karen. I'll put contact information into the chat if anyone wants to reach out about the voter education and get out the vote efforts of Every Woman Vote 2020. That includes several organizations, and it can include more.
And we'll try to include a lot of the information that is in the chat in our next newsletter. We develop a summary of the meetings that have occurred the previous month and publish it in the newsletter. So Sherry and can you save the chats with all the wonderful links that people have put in? If you all have other things to put in the chat, we can record it also in the newsletter. So it'll be publicly available. Our next newsletter will be in September. We announce our next activities for the next year. It looks like we're going to be having Zoom activities probably through the next year till we get a vaccine where everybody can be safe. Please join in, and we're also looking for new organizational members. We'd like to have some organizations in the health area because we haven't had too much there, and that's a very important part of women's rights. Anything people like to add, Anne?
Yeah, I wanted to ask Karen, because one of the things that I've heard is that there's a huge, I can't remember the number, there's like millions of people, of women had not voted. Does she have that?
I have it in my head.
Oh, good.
In 2018, the combination of two categories of women. First, the women who never registered to vote, but were eligible to register to vote, plus the women who were registered but did not turn out to vote in 2018. That combined number is 53 million women.
Wow.
And women vote in higher percentages than men, but I could not think of a better way to celebrate and commemorate women's suffrage than to encourage women to turn out and vote. And the best way to encourage them is through the organizations to which they belong. We call it trusted sources. If the head of an organization is suggesting that it's important, we'll never get equal pay or we'll never get arms control or whatever the issue is, unless we are electing the policymakers who agree with us, they're much more likely to register and vote than if a stranger suggests it. And in this year, when with COVID, the traditional approaches for and methodology for registering voters with using canvassing or tabling at supermarkets and whatever, we can't use those because of COVID. And so the approach that we're suggesting, and I put the web page, the link to the web page in the chat. And, so if the approach that we use is really going to be the only approach that any organization is going to be used that can be effective, and that is reaching out. You know, when Connie reach out to CWI, we pay attention. And so when people reach out to their friends and neighbors and colleagues and say it's important to register and vote, they're more likely to do it than if a stranger does it. So thank you for the question, and thank you for the time, Sue and Connie and everyone else who's here. It's an important network for sharing information.
It is.
And now I have to go raise some money for Every Woman Vote 2020. So I do 2 or 3 calls a day to potential donors. So if you know of any rich people who'd like to support this, let me know. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Donna, did you want to say something?
Well, you know, I really just want to say that I appreciate having this opportunity to do this meeting by Zoom. I know that because of COVID, even in my everyday work, and work with the caucus, it's just, it's teaching us new ways to connect and network. And I hope that we will consider maybe continuing meeting by Zoom. I think it would be, rather than just a conference call, I think it's great. And to be able to have a speaker and see them. I thought the speakers were very good also, a lot of good information. Thank you for putting it together.
Great. Thank you. Anyone else want to have any comments for the common good?
I want to commend Jenalyn again for that great presentation. I think when we go and we look at that information that's in the letter and on the website, We Demand More, we recognize just how thoroughly this was researched and how it was so targeted to women and what is happening to women and how we're getting kind of pushed back into the 1800s, it feels like to me, by what's going on. And we need to, I don't want to say fight back, we need to move forward is what we need to do. And just tell those people they're wrong.
We need to
Hopefully-
send them all out.
By January 20th, we can move forward with full force.
Yes.
Thank you all for joining us.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me.
Thanks, Jenalyn.
Thank you.